The twin suns of Varellus 9 cast harsh shadows across the colony's water reclamation facility, their light gleaming off the massive filtration tanks that dominated the complex. Each drop processed here was precious more valuable than the rare minerals that had first drawn settlers to this arid world. Water meant life, and life meant following protocol. Elena Thales ran her webbed fingers along the control panel's smooth surface, her iridescent blue-green skin reflecting the facility's sterile lighting. As a third-generation Aquari engineer, she carried the weight of expectation in every graceful movement. Her people had evolved in the deep oceans of their homeworld, their bodies adapted for aquatic life with their streamlined forms and natural affinity for water systems. Here on Varellus 9, they were the undisputed masters of water management. Filtration System 7 requires maintenance, announced Chief Engineer Vorthen through the comb, his voice carrying the authority that came with decades of service. Standard protocol. Full isolation in 30 minutes. Elena nodded, though. He couldn't see her. At 26, she was young for such responsibility, but her family's reputation opened doors that talent alone might not have managed. The Thales name meant something in the outer colonies. It meant reliability, honor, and an unbroken line of service to the Aquari people. She glanced across the facility floor and spotted a figure in maintenance coveralls, methodically checking pressure readings on the secondary systems. Corwin Hayes moved with quiet efficiency, his dark hair perpetually disheveled, brown eyes focused intently on his work. Like most humans on Varellus 9, he occupied the lower rungs of the social ladder, relegated to basic maintenance and manual labor. The humans puzzled Elena. They were so fragile, yet they'd somehow spread across the galaxy with startling tenacity. Their short lifespans should have made them cautious, but instead they seemed almost recklessly bold at times. Not that she'd ever spoken to one at length. Social protocols discouraged such interactions unless absolutely necessary for work. Beginning System 7 isolation. Vorthen's voice crackled again. Elena entered the filtration chamber, her movements fluid and practiced. The tank towered above her, a cylindrical giant holding thousands of gallons of precious water in various stages of purification. The familiar hum of recycling systems created a symphony she'd known since childhood. When her father would bring her to similar facilities and explain the sacred duty of their people, water was life, water was honor, water was everything. The isolation process had begun, pressure equalizing as the massive tank prepared for maintenance. Elena ran her diagnostics, checking seals and monitoring output levels. Everything appeared normal, the routine maintenance that kept their world alive. Across the facility, Corwin paused in his work. Something felt off, though he couldn't pinpoint what. Years of maintaining machinery had given him an intuition for systems under stress, the subtle vibrations and sounds that preceded failure. He set down his tools and moved closer to Filtration System 7, his trained ear catching an irregular rhythm in the pump cycles. The Aquari engineers were brilliant, no question about that. Their innate understanding of fluid dynamics surpassed anything humans had achieved. But Corwin had learned that brilliance sometimes bred overconfidence, and overconfidence led to missed warning signs. Inside the tank, Elena felt the first tremor through the metal walls. A slight shift in pressure that shouldn't have been there. She looked up toward the access hatch, frowning. The isolation should have been complete by now, but something was wrong with the sequence. The emergency klaxon shattered the afternoon quiet. Red lights flashed as safety systems engaged, but the damage was already done. A cascade failure in the pressure regulation system had triggered emergency lockdown protocols, with Elena still inside the tank. The access hatch sealed with a resonant clang that echoed through the chamber like a death knell. Emergency lockdown activated, the facility's automated voice announced with mechanical calm. All personnel maintain safe distance from System 7. Elena pressed against the sealed hatch, her heart's racing in the dual rhythm of her species. The water level was rising as backup systems engaged, designed to prevent contamination at all costs. In minutes, the tank would be completely flooded, a safety measure that assumed no living being would be trapped inside. Her voice echoed off the curved walls as she pounded against the metal. "Help! Someone help me! I'm trapped in here." Outside, a crowd began to gather. Aquari engineers and facility supervisors clustered around the sealed tank, their faces masks of concern and calculation. But none of them moved toward the emergency override. None of them reached for the manual release. Corwin pushed through the crowd, his maintenance badge drawing suspicious glances from the higher-ranked Aquari. He could hear something, a voice, desperate and frightened, coming from inside the tank. "Someone's in there," he said, looking around at the assembled engineers. Chief Engineer Vorthen shook his head gravely. "Protocol forbids opening the system during emergency lockdown. Contamination risk is too high. But someone's going to drown. The system will resolve itself. We must trust in proper procedure." Corwin stared at the gathered crowd of Elena's own people, brilliant minds who could calculate water flow to the milliliter, who had built the systems that kept the colony alive. And they were going to let her die rather than risk breaking. Protocol. The water level continued rising, and somewhere inside that steel tomb, a young woman was running out of time. The water level inside the filtration tank had risen past Elena's waist, the cold liquid seeping through her work suit with relentless persistence. Her webbed hands pressed against the sealed hatch above, searching desperately for any weakness. In the emergency locks, the automated systems hummed with mechanical indifference, following their programming with deadly precision. "Please," her voice cracked with desperation. "The override codes, someone use the override codes." Outside, Chief Engineer Vorthen consulted his tablet with practiced calm, though sweat beaded on his scaled forehead. "Emergency protocols are clear. Opening the system during contamination lockdown could compromise the entire water supply. We cannot risk the lives of 50,000 colonists for what? For what?" Corwin interrupted, his voice cutting through the engineer's justification. "For one person? For someone who's part of your own species?" The Aquari engineers shifted uncomfortably. Several looked away, unable to meet Corwin's accusatory gaze. Among them stood Kelton Thales, Ilana's father, a respected water systems designer whose face had gone ashen beneath his blue-green skin. "The contamination protocols exist for good reason," Kelton said quietly, though his hands trembled. "If we breach them now, your daughter is going to die," Corwin stated flatly. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Inside the tank, the water had reached Elena's chest. Her species could hold their breath far longer than humans, could survive in aquatic environments that would kill other beings, but even Aquari had limits. The tank was designed to be completely filled, leaving no air pocket for survival. "The system will equalize in 14 minutes, announced another engineer, consulting his readings. "Full drainage and reset. If she can find an air pocket, 14 minutes? Corwin looked around at the assembled crowd in disbelief. She'd be unconscious in 5, dead in 10. More Aquari had gathered, drawn by news of the emergency. Elena's colleagues, her friends from the engineering academy, members of her extended family. They watched the sealed tank with expressions of anguish and helplessness, bound by the same protocols that had shaped their civilization for generations. Protocol meant survival. Protocol meant order. Protocol meant that sometimes individual lives were sacrificed for the greater good. But Corwin Hayes had never been bound by their protocols. He pushed past the crowd toward the tank's maintenance ladder, his work boots clanging against the metal rungs. Behind him, voices rose in alarm and protest. "Stop, You cannot. The contamination risk. Security. Someone call security. Corwin ignored them all. At the top of the tank, he found the manual override panel, a backup system designed for extreme emergencies, protected by a thin sheet of breakable polymer. His fist shattered the covering, and he yanked the emergency release lever with enough force to bend the metal. Warning klaxons shrieked as the hatch unsealed with a hiss of escaping pressure. Below him, dark water reflected the emergency lighting, and somewhere beneath the surface was a young woman fighting for her life. He didn't hesitate, didn't consider the career implications or social consequences, didn't think about the frigid water or his own limitations as a land-dwelling human. He simply drew a deep breath and dove. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending shock waves through his nervous system. The water was treated with chemical agents that made it taste metallic and harsh, nothing like the clean oceans of Earth he'd known in his youth. Visibility was nearly zero in the murky depths, the tank's interior lit only by emergency strips that cast ghostly shadows through the fluid. Corwin forced himself deeper, his lungs burning as he fought against his body's natural buoyancy. The tank was enormous, a cathedral of metal and water that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. His movements were clumsy compared to the graceful efficiency of the equerry, but desperation gave him strength. A flash of movement in the shadows caught his eye. There a figure sinking slowly toward the tank's bottom, no longer fighting against the water's embrace. Elena had lost consciousness, her body drifting with the artificial currents created by the filtration systems. Corwin kicked harder, his muscles screaming in protest as oxygen deprivation began to take its toll. His fingers brushed against fabric, then found purchase on Elena's worksuit. She was heavier than he'd expected, her equerry physiology dense with adaptations for deep water survival. But he wrapped his arms around her waist and kicked toward the surface with everything he had left. The water seemed to fight him, pulling them both back toward the depths. His vision began to tunnel, black spots dancing at the edges of his sight. His lungs felt ready to burst, every instinct screaming for him to breathe, to gulp in the liquid death that surrounded them. But he held on to the unconscious woman in his arms, held on to the desperate hope that they could both survive. His legs pumped mechanically, driven by pure willpower as his conscious mind began to fade. They broke the surface with explosive gasps, Corwin sucking in precious air, while Elena remained limp in his arms. Around the rim of the tank, dozens of faces stared down at them, the crowd of equerry engineers finally spurred to action by the human's example. "Get medical," someone shouted. "Lower the emergency lift. Clear the area, give them space." Kelton Thales leaned over the tank's edge, his face streaked with tears as he reached for his daughter. Elena, can you hear me?" She stirred. Weakly, water streaming from her gills as they fluttered back to life. Her eyes opened large, dark, and filled with confusion as she tried to process what had happened. Her gaze found Corwin first, still treading water beside her with exhausted determination. "You ... she whispered, her voice barely audible above. "The tank's mechanical systems. You came for me." The emergency lift descended, operated by equerry engineers who had suddenly remembered their duties now that the immediate crisis was past. As they were hauled to safety, Elena never took her eyes off the human who had risked everything to save her life. Around them, her people busied themselves with damage control and procedure reviews, already crafting the reports that would explain how such a failure had occurred. But none of their explanations would address the real failure, the failure of courage, of compassion, of simple decency in the face of bureaucratic protocol. Only the human had stepped forward when it mattered. Only Corwin Hayes had been willing to risk everything for someone he barely knew, simply because it was right. As medical teams rushed to treat them both, Elena felt something shift inside. A fundamental change in how she viewed the world and her place in it. The water that had nearly killed her seemed to wash away more than just the filtration chemicals. It cleansed her of assumptions, of prejudices, of the comfortable certainties that had shaped her life. She had been saved not by her own peoples, advanced technology or superior evolution, but by one human's simple, stubborn refusal to let her die alone. The medical bay's sterile white walls felt like a sanctuary after the metallic confines of the water tank. Elena lay on the treatment bed, her gill slits sealed with biopatches as the medical team monitored her recovery. The filtration chemicals had irritated her respiratory system, but her aquariphysiology was proving remarkably resilient. Lung function is returning to normal, Dr. Varick announced, studying the readings on his scanner. The chemical exposure was minimal, thanks to your natural filtration adaptations. You were fortunate. Fortunate. The word felt hollow in her ears. She had been fortunate that a human maintenance worker possessed more courage than her entire species engineering course. Fortunate that someone had been willing to ignore protocol when protocol meant death. Where is he? She asked, her voice still rough from the ordeal. The human? He's in the next room, receiving treatment for hypothermia and chemical exposure. His recovery will take longer. Humans aren't adapted for prolonged submersion in treated water. Dr. Varick's tone carried the clinical detachment typical of her people. You should rest now. Your father is waiting outside. But Elena wasn't ready to face her father, wasn't ready for the mixture of relief and shame she'd seen in his eyes at the tank. Instead, she waited until the medical team departed, then slipped from her bed and padded barefoot to the adjacent treatment room. Corwin lay beneath thermal blankets, his skin still pale from cold exposure. Monitoring equipment tracked his vital signs with soft beeps and chirps. He looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than he had when diving fearlessly into the depths. His dark hair was still damp, and she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. You shouldn't be up, he said quietly, noticing her presence without opening his eyes. Neither should you. She approached the bed cautiously, unsure of human customs regarding personal space. How did you know I was here? Your people make different sounds when they walk. Lighter, more fluid. He opened his eyes then, meeting her gaze with those warm brown irises that seemed to hold depths of their own. How are you feeling? The question was so simple, yet loaded with complexity. How was she feeling? Grateful, certainly. Confused, absolutely. But also something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with her recent trauma. Alive, she said, settling into the chair beside his bed. Thanks to you. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, she said firmly. They wouldn't have. They didn't. My own people. She stopped, the words catching in her throat. They were going to let me die rather than risk contamination protocols. Corwin was quiet for a moment, studying her face. They were scared. Sometimes fear makes people freeze up, makes them forget what's really important. You weren't scared? He laughed softly, a sound with no humor in it. I was terrified. I'm not a strong swimmer. I had no idea how deep that tank was, and water was cold enough to stop my heart. But he paused, seeming to search for the right words. But you were going to die if I didn't try. That seemed more important than being scared. The simplicity of his reasoning struck her like a physical blow. No complex moral calculations, no risk assessments or protocol reviews. Just a fundamental recognition that life was precious and worth protecting, regardless of species or social status. My father came to see you, she said, changing the subject before her emotions could overwhelm her. While you were unconscious, he wanted to thank you. But she had always been perceptive, but something about Corwin's presence seemed to sharpen her awareness. But he's also afraid of what this means for his career, for our family's reputation. Owing a debt to a human, ... Is that what you think this is? A debt? The question hung between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to examine. Elena found herself studying his face, the strong jaw, the laugh lines around his eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead in unruly waves. He was handsome by human standards, she supposed, though she had never really considered what made humans attractive. I don't know what this is, she admitted. The medical bay's doors hissed open, and Chief Engineer Vorthen entered with a small delegation of facility administrators. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but Elena could read the tension in their movements, the way they avoided direct eye contact with Corwin. Miss Thales, Vorthen began formally, we're conducting a full review of the incident. Your statement will be required for the official report. Of course. She rose from her chair, but remained positioned between the administrators and Corwin's. Bed, will Corwin's actions be recognized in this report? An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Finally, Administrator Jecklin cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes violated established safety protocols, while his intentions were admirable. We cannot officially condone actions that put the colony's water supply at risk. Put it at risk? Elena's voice rose dangerously. He saved my life, and we're grateful for that, Vorthen interjected quickly. But protocol exists for the protection of everyone. If you make exceptions, people live. Corwin's quiet voice stopped the conversation cold. He struggled to sit up, waving away Elena's attempt to help. I've read your protocols. They're well designed for equipment failures, chemical spills, contamination events. But nowhere in those manuals does it say what to do when someone's trapped inside, because your people never considered that possibility. The systems are designed to prevent systems fail, Corwin interrupted. That's why you employ maintenance workers like me, to fix what your perfect systems can't prevent. He met each administrator's gaze in turn. Your protocols failed. Today, not because they're wrong, but because they're incomplete. They don't account for the human element, the possibility that sometimes rules need to be broken to save lives. The delegation exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was not going as they had planned. They had expected to find a grateful victim, and a chastened rule breaker, not a young woman defending her rescuer, and a human challenging their fundamental assumptions. Nevertheless, Administrator Jecklin said stiffly, there will be an inquiry. Mr. Hayes, you're suspended from duty, pending the investigation's outcome. Sir, Elena stood, her posture shifting into something more formal, more dangerous. I am Elena Thales, third-generation water systems engineer, daughter of senior designer Kelton Thales. My family has served this colony for 60 years without incident. If you pursue disciplinary action against the man who saved my life, I will resign my position and ensure that every media outlet in the sector knows exactly why. The threat hung in the air like a live wire. The Thales family's reputation carried significant weight, and a public scandal involving their water management systems could have devastating consequences for the colony's political standing. Administrator Jecklin's expression soured, but he nodded curtly. The inquiry will be thorough and fair. All perspectives will be considered. As the delegation filed out, Elena sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving her aware of her body's lingering weakness. Thank you, Corwin said softly. For what? For standing up for me. You didn't have to do that. She turned to look at him, this human who had risked everything for her without hesitation, who faced bureaucratic punishment with the same quiet dignity he had shown in diving into. At tank." "Yes," she said simply. "I did." For the first time since the rescue, she saw him smile, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. In that moment, something shifted inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with medical treatment or environmental controls. She was beginning to understand that gratitude was only the beginning of what she felt for Corwin Hayes. 3 days had passed since the incident, and Elena found herself standing outside the modest residential complex that housed the colony's human workers. The building was functional, but sparse a far cry from the elegant towers where a quarry. Families lived, with their flowing architecture and integrated water features. Here, geometric efficiency ruled over aesthetic beauty. She had visited Corwin's quarters every day since their discharge from the medical bay, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. Officially, she was checking on his recovery. Unofficially, she was discovering that she simply enjoyed his company in ways that surprised her. "You don't have to keep coming here," Corwin said as he opened the door, though his smile suggested he was pleased to see her. "I'm fine, really." His small apartment was clean but utilitarian, furnished with standard colony housing: a bed, a desk, a small food preparation area. What caught her attention were the personal touches: sketches of mechanical systems pinned to the walls, a collection of tools arranged with almost artistic precision, and books, actual physical books. A rarity in the digital age. "What are these?" she asked, running her fingers along the book spines. "Engineering manuals mostly, some fiction." He moved beside her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of his soap, feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "I like having physical copies. Digital files can be corrupted or deleted, but books endure." She pulled one from the shelf, a worn volume titled Fluid Dynamics in Zero-G Environments. The pages were filled with notes in Corwin's precise handwriting, diagrams and calculations that showed a deep understanding of the subject. "You've studied this extensively," she observed. "I may be just a maintenance worker, but I like to understand the systems I'm repairing." His tone carried a hint of defensiveness that made her look up sharply. "I didn't mean," she stopped, recognizing the assumption embedded in her words. "I'm sorry. I've spent so long thinking of humans as ... limited. It's hard to unlearn generations of conditioning. And what do you think now?" The question was asked quietly, but she could hear the importance behind it. This wasn't casual conversation. This was a test, a moment that would define whatever was growing between them. "I think," she said carefully, "that my people have been fools. We've allowed our technological advantages to blind us to other forms of intelligence, other kinds of strength." She moved closer to him, drawn by an impulse she didn't fully understand. "You see things we miss. You act when we hesitate. You dove into a tank of freezing water to save someone you barely knew." "I knew enough," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I knew you were worth saving." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. They were standing very close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the way his pulse beat at his throat. The rational part of her mind cataloged the differences between them, the variations in bone structure, skin texture, the way his body heat seemed to radiate outward like a small sun. But the rational part of her mind was being overwhelmed by something far more primitive, far more urgent. "Elena." Her name on his lips sounded different somehow, weighted with meanings she was only beginning to understand. "This ... Whatever this is between us ... It's complicated. I know." She reached up to touch his face, her webbed fingers tracing the line of his jaw. His skin was softer than she had expected, warm and alive beneath her touch. "My family, my career, the social expectations. I don't care about any of that," he interrupted, his hand covering hers. But I care about you, about what this could mean for your future. The concern in his voice, the way he put her well-being above his own desires, only deepened the growing ache in her chest. When had anyone ever worried about her future with such genuine care? Her family loved her, certainly, but their love came wrapped in expectations and social calculations. Corwin's concern was pure, uncomplicated by status or advantage. What if I don't want the future they've planned for me? She whispered. The question hung between them, laden with implications that went far beyond personal attraction. She was talking about abandoning everything she had been raised to believe, everything her society expected of her. Corwin's thumb brushed across her cheek, the gesture so tender it made her eyes flutter closed. Then you choose a different future, but make sure it's what you really want, not just a reaction to what happened in that tank. You think this is just gratitude? Some kind of trauma response? I think, he said slowly, that you've had your world turned upside down in the past few days. I think you're questioning everything you believed about your people, about humans, about yourself. And I think maybe you should be sure about what you're feeling before you make any decisions you can't take back. His wisdom frustrated her, even as it endeared him to her further. She wanted him to be selfish, to pull her closer and damn the consequences. Instead, he was being thoughtful, protective, putting her needs before his own desires. What if I am? Sure? She asked, opening her eyes to meet his gaze directly. What if I've never been more certain of anything in my life? For a moment, his careful control wavered. She saw the want in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched with the effort of restraint. Then he leaned forward, closing the distance between them with agonizing slowness, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was tentative at first, exploratory, each of them learning the texture and taste of the other. His mouth was warm and soft, his kiss gentle despite the obvious hunger beneath his restraint. She pressed closer, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, marveling at its silky texture. The differences between their species became irrelevant, overwhelmed by more fundamental similarities, the need for connection, for understanding, for someone who saw past surface appearances to the person beneath. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Corwin rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face with reverent care. This is going to cause problems, he murmured, though he made no move to step away. Let it, she replied fiercely. Let them all talk. Let them disapprove. I've spent my entire life following their rules, meeting their expectations, and where did it get me? Trapped in a tank while they debated protocols. And now? She smiled, feeling more alive than she had in years. Now I follow my own path. Starting with this. Starting with you. Outside, the twin suns of Varellus 9 were setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. But inside Corwin's small apartment, a different kind of warmth was growing, something that had nothing to do with environmental controls and everything to do with two people discovering that connection could transcend species, status, and expectation. They had crossed a threshold, and there would be no going back. But as Corwin's arms encircled her, as she felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, Elena found she had no desire to return to the person she had been before that fateful dive into dark waters. She had been rescued in more ways than one, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The inquiry hearing was held in the colony's main administrative center, a gleaming structure that embodied Aquari architectural principles with its flowing curves and integrated water features. Elena sat in the witness section, her formal, engineering uniform crest and pristine, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Across the chamber, Corwin waited in the defendant's section, his maintenance coveralls replaced by borrowed civilian clothing that didn't quite fit his human frame. The past week had been a whirlwind of private meetings, family conferences, and increasingly urgent discussions about her future. Her father had made his position clear. The family's reputation was at stake, and her association with the human maintenance worker was becoming an embarrassment that threatened their standing in the colony's hierarchy. But the nights had been hers and Corwin's alone. Administrator Jekyllin called the session to order, his scaled features arranged in an expression of bureaucratic neutrality. This inquiry has been convened to examine the events surrounding the emergency at Water Filtration System 7 and to determine appropriate action regarding Mr. Corwin Hayes's violation of established safety protocols. As if on cue, the chambers. Doors opened to admit a small parade of witnesses. Chief Engineer Vorthen took the stand first, delivering a clinical recitation of events that painted Corwin's rescue as a dangerous breach of protocol that had potentially compromised the colony's water safety. The subject ignored direct orders to maintain safe distance, Vorthen testified. His actions, while emotionally understandable, violated 3 separate safety regulations and could have resulted in contamination of our primary water supply. Next came Dr. Varick, whose medical testimony focused on the risks Corwin had assumed by diving into chemically treated water without proper protective equipment. The human physiology is not adapted for such exposure. Mr. Hayes could easily have lost consciousness underwater, creating a second victim requiring rescue. Through it all, Corwin sat quietly, his expression calm despite the growing pile of evidence against him. When Administrator Jekyllin finally called him to testify, he rose with dignity intact. "Mr. Hayes," Jekyllin began, "do you dispute any of the technical evidence presented regarding your violation of safety protocols?" "No, sir. I broke the rules." "Do you acknowledge that your actions could have resulted in water contamination, affecting thousands of colonists?" "Yes, sir. Though I would point out that actual contamination risk was minimal. The tank's contents were already isolated for maintenance. Nevertheless, you acted without authorization, without proper safety equipment, and in direct contradiction of your supervisor's orders. What do you have to say in your defense?" Corwin was quiet for a long moment, his gaze sweeping across the assembled officials before settling on Elena. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "I have no defense. Sir, what I have is a question. What would you have done?" The inquiry panel exchanged glances. This was not how these proceedings typically went. "I beg your pardon?" Jekyllin asked. "If it had been your daughter in that tank, your wife, your sister, someone you cared about, drowning while protocols were debated, what would you have done?" "That is not relevant." Corwin's voice carried an edge now, controlled anger giving his words more weight. "I think it's the only thing that's relevant. You can cite regulations all you want, but at the end of the day, a person was dying and no one else was willing to act. So I did what I had to do, and I'd do it again." The chamber erupted in whispered conversations as the panel members conferred. But Elena could see the writing on the wall. Corwin was going to be punished for his heroism, made an example to preserve the sanctity of protocol over human decency. She stood, her movement causing conversations to halt. "Administrator Jekyllin, I request permission to address this panel. Miss Thales' witness testimony has concluded, and I'm not speaking as a witness." She moved to the center of the chamber, her voice carrying clearly to every corner. "I'm speaking as the person whose life was saved by Corwin Hayes. I'm speaking as an inquiry engineer who has spent her entire career following the protocols that nearly killed me." She could see her father in the gallery, his face pale with horror at her public defiance. But she pressed on, driven by a conviction that had been growing stronger each day. "You want to punish him for breaking rules that would have let me die. You want to maintain a system that values procedure over life, compliance over compassion. And maybe that worked when we were the only species on this colony, when our ways were the only ways. She turned to face Corwin, drawing strength from his encouraging nod. But we're not alone anymore. And maybe it's time we learned something from our human colleagues about what really matters. Miss Thales, Administrator Jacqueline warned, you are out of order. Am I? Then let me be very clear about something else. She faced the panel directly, her voice carrying the authority of her family name and her professional credentials. If this panel finds Mr. Hayes guilty of misconduct for saving my life, I will resign my position immediately. I will also ensure that every media outlet in this sector knows exactly how this colony treats heroes who happen to be human. The threat of public scandal hung heavy in the air. Bad publicity could affect everything from colonial funding to immigration applications. The administrators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Elena wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, I am formally requesting reassignment to work directly with Mr. Hayes on improving our emergency response protocols. It's clear that our current systems have dangerous gaps, and I believe his practical experience combined with my technical knowledge could prevent future tragedies. Chief Engineer Vorthen rose from his seat. Miss Thales, such an arrangement would be highly irregular. So was letting someone drown because the manual didn't specifically address that scenario. Her words cut through his objection like a blade. We can adapt, or we can cling to protocols that nearly cost us a valuable engineer. The choice is yours. Administrator Jacqueline called for a recess, and Elena found herself surrounded by concerned family members and colleagues. But she pushed through the crowd to reach Corwin, who was being escorted to a holding area. That was incredible, he said softly, catching her hands in his. But you didn't have to. Yes, I did. She looked up at him, no longer caring who might be watching. You saved my life, Corwin. All of it. Not just in that tank, but everything that came after. You showed me what courage looks like, what it means to put people before protocols. Elena. He glanced around at the crowd of observers, the media, representatives already streaming into the chamber. Are you sure about this? Once you make this public, there's no going back. She smiled, feeling freer than she had in her entire life. I'm sure. About this, about us, about everything. Rising on her toes, she kissed him in full view of the assembled crowd, a declaration that transcended words. The reaction was immediate. An explosive gasps from the Aquari Gallery, excited chatter from the human observers, the rapid clicking of recording devices. But Elena ignored it all, lost in the warmth of Corwin's response and the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. When they broke apart, she could see tears in his eyes. I love you, he whispered. The words meant only for her despite the public setting. I love you too, she replied, not caring who heard. The panel reconvened an hour later with a decision that surprised no one who had witnessed Elena's testimony. Corwin's violation of protocol was officially noted in his record, but no disciplinary action would be taken given the exceptional circumstances of the emergency. Furthermore, the colony would be implementing new emergency response procedures, developed jointly by the engineering department and maintenance staff. As they left the administrative center together, Elena felt the weight of disapproving stares from some quarters, but also saw nods of approval from others humans and Aquari, alike who recognized that something important had changed that day. So what happens now? Corwin asked as they walked through the colony's central plaza, the twin suns setting behind them in a blaze of orange and gold. Now we write new protocols, Elena said, squeezing his hand. We build better systems. We make sure no one else gets trapped while people debate procedures. And us? She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. This remarkable human who had shown her species what true courage looked like. Us? We continue diving into deep waters together. Whatever comes next, We face it as a team. Around them, the colony continued its daily rhythms, a quarry and humans working side by side to maintain their shared home among the stars. But something had shifted in the social currents, a recognition that survival required more than just technical expertise and rigid protocols. Sometimes it required the willingness to break rules for something more important. Sometimes it required love. As they walked toward their shared future, Elena reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day in the filtration tank. She had been drowning in more ways than one, suffocating under the weight of expectations and protocols and social hierarchies that valued compliance over compassion.